The sea above the Luzon Strait was a cold ceiling of moonlit steel, and beneath it a Balao-class hull drifted like a shadow inside a shadow. The boat carried the name USS Archerfish SS-311, etched into a conning tower that never surfaced without a reason. Pumps ticked, bearings breathed, and the ship's heartbeat fell to 2 knots, creep speed. A bathythermograph trace lay clipped under a red lamp, a pencil line showing a thermal layer inversion at roughly 260 feet, thick enough to bend active pings upward and smear them into the night. Sonar marked it as a soft curtain between death and routine. The officer of the deck did not speak. He did not need to. Every man aboard knew that under the layer a boat became a rumor. Archerfish had been popularized. By a single kill the world would later print in big letters, "The carrier sunk off Honshu in November 1944, but this patrol was different and would never be photographed." Before they left Pearl, the boat had taken on crates marked for the Fleet Sonar School and 2 nondescript cylinders for the torpedo room. The paperwork said, "Experimental counter-detection assemblies," which meant the crew called them what sailors always did, luck. The cylinders were bolt-on sleeves for a pair of Mark 27 Cutie acoustic homers, their noses refitted with damped diaphragms and a narrowband filter, tuned for the higher harmonics of Japanese destroyer screws. In theory, the fish would hear through the clutter. In practice, nothing heard better than a quiet ship. The Pacific, early 1945, was a maze of hunted and hunter, of convoy lanes stitched between Formosa, the Ryukyus, and the home islands. Japan still pushed fuel north aboard small tankers hugged by Kaiboken escorts, often former trawlers with Type 93 sonar bolted under their bows. The U.S. Navy answered with radar pickets and air patrols. But at night and in bad water, the work fell to submarines. Archerfish was a veteran among them, but the crew would later say this patrol felt different from the first hour. The boat's machinery had been re-rafted on new rubber mounts at Mare Island. The main motor brushes were dressed to a mirror. The rudder telemotor lash had been tuned by a chief who swore he could feel 1/1000th of an inch through his hands. When the boat stepped down to silent, the ocean stopped listening. At 0209, the QHB sonar array traced a distant beat. 4 blades, quick cadence, likely a destroyer at 14 knots, northeast bearing, opening. The soundman wrote the ticks as dashes in grease pencil across the screen's lower edge, then breathed through his nose to keep from fogging the faceplate. On the chart table, pencil marks connected guest positions along a convoy track that matched ultra-inferred routing through the Bashi Channel. Archerfish did not sprint. She drifted into the layer and waited for the geometry to tip in her favor. The hinge line of the night came as a single wide ping that rolled over the hull like a steel drum struck with a mallet. Loud, then thinner, then gone. The escort was searching above the layer. Archerfish below it remained a rumor. 2 hours earlier, a narrow crate had been opened in the forward battery hatch for just long enough to slide in a slate-gray box with a braided cable tail. It was a passive add-on for the existing WCA fire control suite, an analog resolver that blended bearings from QHB and the loop, hydrophone into a smoother target motion slope. The fleet had learned the hard way that silence without fire control was just hiding. Someone in the Pearl Labs had learned the opposite. The quieter the platform, the more time it had to sample and average the noise field. Time was accuracy. Accuracy meant fewer shots. Fewer shots meant staying quiet. The logic closed like a diagram. Archerfish eased west by north using a negligible helm, letting the East China Sea's winter current shoulder her toward the convoy lane. The SD air search mast stayed down. The SJ surface radar stayed off. In the pump room, a machinist's mate rested his fingertips on the casing to feel micro-vibrations, a habit learned over 6 patrols. The negative tank valve had been chalk-marked earlier, a reminder that a snap dive could be ordered any time. But the night asked for patience, not drama. Above, a line of hulls pushed to the northeast, their screws drawing cavitation from blades that had been polished in another war and worn dull in this one. At 8:03:17, a new texture joined the noise. A low, steady grind that the soundman recognized as a lightly loaded merchantman at convoy speed, maybe 8 knots. The grease pencil arcs tightened. The fire control party folded 3 minutes of bearing drift into a course line that ran like a string between 2 islands. The first micro-reveal lived in the silence itself. Archerfish would not go to periscope depth for a look. She would not risk a wake. Instead, she would solve a firing problem with sound alone, using a narrow aperture of metal and discipline. The plan was simple and unromantic. Press in from the shadow side. Put a single Mark 14 into the fat ship from 200 yards. Slide down and away under the layer before anyone could draw a bead. The layer thickened to the point where pings hit it and splashed sideways. The escort's search widened. A typewriter in the con, secured by webbing, shivered with a shallow vibration every time the trim pumps worked, a reminder that even silence had a pulse. The helmsman held 2 degrees of right rudder for a count of 60, then steadied, then repeated. On the chart, the maneuvers were microscopic doglegs that barely moved the pencil line. In the water, they meant everything. Each small angle kept the bow on the bearing drift without building a detectable turn at the screws. A fact lives in the logs. Between Oro 150 and 340, Archerfish changed RPM by no more than 1/2 a notch on any motor. The reason was printed in a training note that rode every Balao to sea by this point in the war. Harmonics betray headings. In empty water, a fast boat is just noisy. In a layered sea, even a slow boat can ring the ocean if its machinery wobbles across frequencies. Archerfish's upgrade had finally aligned the boat's heartbeat with its purpose. By 0351, the range line met the firing point triangle. The torpedo data computer, a brass-geared brain the size of a trunk, had been fed nothing but angles and time for an hour, and now its output spoke through indices that lined up in plain numbers. The bow caps were shut but ready, lubricated earlier with a thin film wiped on with gloved fingertips to avoid the squeak that had embarrassed a different boat in a different channel. The target's screw beat, once a texture under the destroyer's brighter churn, grew into a clock of its own, solid, patient, certain. Then a pattern interrupted the ocean's metronome. The convoy began a standard zig at an interval that Ultra had flagged on recent traffic. The merchant kicked 5 degrees to port. The escort shifted its feint to starboard to widen the fan. Archerfish's solution absorbed the change in 3 pencil strokes. The layer held. The rumor stayed a rumor. The hinge line widened from the moment to the mission. The quiet hunt was not just a tactic. It was a program, a test, a proof that a submarine could do its work without ever being counted on an enemy's list of targets. There is a small metal tag in the Mare Island archive that bears Archerfish's hull number and the date 10 January 1945. Stamped into it with a shop hammer, its catalog note reads simply, "Resilient mount, main motor, spec change implemented." The man who swung the hammer left no name. The boat he touched slid under a thermal at 2 knots and rewrote a paragraph of how the Pacific War was fought. That night in the Luzon Strait would show what the shop floor had built: a platform that hunted in silence, and a crew that trusted the math of water more than the adrenaline of chase. Below the layer, a whisper of air moved along the battery well as a cooling fan throttled back 1 increment. The soundman held his breath and listened for the gap between screw notes. A pressure valley that told him the target's blades were shallow cut and probably worn, a merchant that had seen too many miles. On the fire control board, grease lines met like rails. On the boat's log, a neat hand recorded the thing that mattered most: no changes in speed. In that stillness, the mission finally stood up and faced its own claim: an American sub that hunted in silence and never lost a crewman, because on nights like this, it never offered the ocean a reason to take one. By the winter of 1945, the Pacific War had become a duel of sensors more than steel. Every fleet action turned on what could or could not be heard. In Washington, the Navy's Bureau of Ships pushed out quieting directives to every yard: isolate the diesels, balance the propeller shafts, train the crews to treat silence as a weapon. At Pearl Harbor, Commander Charles F. Greene, one of the architects of the Silent Hunter program, took a map of the Western Pacific and drew 3 small circles where convoys still crept through: the Luzon Strait, the East China Sea Gap, and the Bungo Channel. Within those circles, he marked a single letter A, B, or C. Archerfish was assigned to A. The men had already seen the war's brutal arithmetic. By late '44, more than 40 American submarines had been lost, some to depth charges, some to minefields, and some simply vanished without radio or wreckage. Every patrol began with a photo on a bulletin board and ended sometimes with a pin of morning black. Yet Archerfish's crew kept their odd record: 5 war patrols, 0 fatal casualties. The crew joked that the boat was blessed by its mascot, a brass fish plate welded to the periscope stand. But in Pearl's machine shops, engineers credited the numbers to design, not destiny. Balao-class boats like Archerfish carried stronger pressure hulls, an extra 50 feet of crush depth, and the new SD-3 sonar fairing that shaved decibels from their acoustic wake. When she reached Pearl after her 5th patrol, the boat went straight to dry dock for modifications under Project Quiet Edge. The shipyard logs list standard overhauls, propeller refinish, gasket replacement, hull scrape, but inside those same lines appear code letters rarely seen in wartime paperwork. QE, Mount Spec Beta, Close Integration Experimental. The refit lasted 19 days. Technicians from the University of California's underwater Sound Division arrived under Marine Guard with crates of oscillators and wax-sealed transducers. The senior petty officers called them the professors, and the men watched as cables were run beneath deck plates and up into the sonar shack. Nobody explained why. The engineers said only that Archerfish was to operate at lowest acoustic signature ever measured. The chief electrician noticed that each new component carried an acceptance tag stamped Buship's Code 212C, Noise Control Lab, San Diego. What the crew did not see were the memos between Admiral Lockwood's headquarters and the Bureau of Ships. Allied codebreakers had learned that Japanese escorts were experimenting with advanced hydrophones built around German-supplied piezo-ceramic crystals, smaller, faster, more sensitive. To stay ahead, the Americans needed proof that their own noise reduction theory worked in the field. Archerfish would become the proof. The experiment demanded absolute secrecy. A single broadcast, a single raised periscope could ruin the data. In place of a patrol report, her commanding officer, Commander Joseph Enright, was given a sealed envelope labeled Supplement E, Ultra Quiet Protocol. Inside were 3 rules: remain submerged whenever possible, attack by sound bearings alone, and never exceed 2,000 RPM on the main motors except to evade. The captain gathered the crew in the forward battery compartment before departure. The air smelled of oil and graphite. He told them only that the mission would test the Navy's newest silent running procedures. If it succeeded, he said, future submariners might live longer than luck allowed. They did not cheer. They simply nodded and went back to their stations. War had taught them that quiet promises were better than loud speeches. On 27 December 1944, Archerfish slipped from Pearl's South Channel under a rising moon. Her wake dissolved in seconds. Radar masts were lashed down, the deck gun shrouded. Every joint, every hinge, every tool had been wrapped or oiled. Even the galley pots were padded with canvas. Once clear of the harbor lights, she submerged and began the 5,000-mile crawl to the Luzon Strait. She carried 6 Mark 14 steam torpedoes, 4 Mark 18 electrics, and 2 of the new Mark 27, cuties with their modified acoustic noses. On the chart table lay a copy of hydrographic chart, number 6283, the graveyard map of the strait, creased from years of use. Her orders were simple: locate and destroy fuel traffic bound for the home islands. Her unspoken mission was simpler still: make no noise while doing it. The Pacific greeted them with storms. For 10 days, the boat ran under gray seas that hammered her bridge watch and shook saltwater through the conning tower hatch seams. Inside, condensation dripped down bulkheads and pooled around electrical fittings. Silence had its own cost. Without the throb of full-speed motors, the crew heard everything: the tick of the gyro, the groan of hull plates, the whisper of breath in the torpedo room. They learned to move as parts of one instrument. When a spanner fell, men flinched like animals under a searchlight. The soundman, Seaman Second Class David Mace, began keeping a log not of targets but of internal noises. FO 300, port diesel mount chatter, 0400, trim pump resonance, 0500, hull singing when depth, 260 of terror. Engineers later called such notes vibration fingerprinting. At the time, it was survival. Every few days they surfaced to ventilate batteries and send a brief coded weather report, one of the few transmissions permitted under the protocol. The ocean would answer with its own message: drifting mine cases, dead sailors in life jackets, the wreckage of a convoy that another submarine had torn apart weeks earlier. War's debris marked the path as surely as buoys, yet through all this the Archerfish kept its strange calm. It was as if the noise had been left behind in Pearl Harbor. By mid-January, she reached her assigned sector, The Luzon Strait lay ahead, a funnel between Bataan Island and the northern tip of Luzon. Japanese traffic flowed through at night, hugging the land to dodge aircraft and radar. Beneath that surface chaos, a hidden geography of sound defined the battlefield. Warm currents from the South China Sea slid under cold Pacific water, forming layers that trapped or reflected sonar pings like mirrors. The charts marked these layers as isotherms, but to submariners they were doors, some open, some locked. Archerfish intended to slip through one and vanish. On the night of January 10th, she made her final trim dive before patrol. Ballast tanks hissed, gauges steadied, lights dimmed to red. The boat leveled off at 265 feet, right inside the predicted thermal. The depth gauge quivered, then stilled. In that moment, the crew entered a world without horizon, governed only by pressure, patience, and trust in the engineers who had rebuilt their ship. The setup was complete. A veteran boat turned experimental ghost sailing into a sea where sound itself could kill. For the next 6 hours, the ocean would decide whether the Navy's theory of silence was science or suicide. The work below decks read like surgery. Technicians crawled into crawl spaces with soldering irons and calipers, sliding new mounts between the diesels and their beds, wrapping exposed flanges with laminated cork, and lacing braided cable runs through the bulkhead like tendons. A removable fairing for the QHB sonar array was fitted with an absorptive rubber collar to smooth its wake. The WCA analog resolver found a home behind the sonar desk, its brass knobs polished and taped so they did not rattle. Every new part carried a shop stamp. QE17A, Noise Control Lab, San Diego, and a serial acceptance number written in India ink. Men who had fixed radios now learned to be acousticians. Men who had polished brass now tuned resonant curves. The core of Project Quiet Edge was not glamour but arithmetic. Reduce the sub's signature at key harmonic bands and teach the crew to live inside the remaining noise. Engineers replaced the standard propeller with a subtly cupped blade profile and countersunk bolt heads into recessed plates to avoid cavitation spikes. Rubber mount spec changes reduced vibration transfer by measurable fractions. The chief engineer kept a slip of paper in his pocket that listed the expected reductions by frequency: 300 Hz, 6 to 9 dB, 50 Hz, 3 to 5 dB, and folded it around his thumb like a prayer. Sailmakers stitched up canvas muffles for the vents. Machinists shimmed bearings by thousandths of an inch, and a small team from the university ran slow-frequency oscillators while the boat idled to find the singular pitch that gave the hull its worst cough. They then taught the motors not to sing that note. Installation came with risks that the lab memos did not tidy away. The new mounts bled heat into places the boat had never seen. At low RPM, condensate pooled in control runs and caused short blips that threatened gyro bearing integrity. The cutie homers, refitted with damped diaphragms, were finicky in layers where thermal inversion bent their acoustic reception. There was the human risk too. Silence demanded discipline so tight that any slip, a slammed hatch, an impatient voice, could invalidate hours of averaged bearings and paint a target. Commander Enright wrote an addendum in his personal log: "Quiet is a fragile force. Protect it with the same ferocity you give to steel." The men respected the line because they had seen the alternative. The first at-sea trials read like a rehearsal for ghosts. In a calibrated bay off Oahu, the boat ran alongside a pair of test barges while labmen recorded responses from hydrophones. The resolvers were fed synthetic bearings and then raw noise samples. The torpedo data computer accepted the analog corrections and spat out firing solutions that matched modeled expectations. On a single run, the analysts ticked off a metric that would later become the patrol's quiet boast: a measured reduction of roughly 8 decibels in radiated noise across the 250-350 Oz band when compared to baseline runs, a decline that meant the difference between a ship's sonar hearing blades and hearing a myth. The tag stamped into a spare resolver later read, QC pass, 08 dB or 300 Hz. For men who trusted numbers more than charm, a stamped tag was a small miracle. Back aboard, training turned theory into habit. The fire control party ran simulated bearings using only loop hydrophone data and the WCA's blended output, closing solutions without periscope input. Torpedo crews practiced dry runs of depth and gyro settings until their hands moved as if memorized by steel. The captain ordered drills where a single misstep disqualified the exercise. No shouted corrections, no gestured panic. only the slow, practiced exchange of hands and indices. In the torpedo room, grease pencil marks multiplied into diagrams that looked like constellations. Intercept geometry, thermal depth bands, predicted bearing drift. Each diagram shortened the margin between a sound and a solid strike. Risk and preparation culminated with an unscheduled contact during a training exercise. A Japanese escort out on calibration trials had run a pattern nearby, apparently testing its own new hydrophone array. The labmen aboard Archerfish had predicted this kind of interference, real-world. Noise was the last exam, and the encounter became the first true trial by enemy sensors. The escort screws showed up on the QHB as a thin, bright band above the thermal. The loop hydrophone painted a wider smear below. For a heartbeat, the boat's engineers watched instruments argue with each other, one saying the contact was high, the other saying low. The WCA resolver averaged the inputs into a single, confident bearing line, and the fire control officer fed that line into the torpedo data computer without ever raising the periscope. A micro-reveal lived in the archives. The trial with the escort was logged as Contact K1, Calibration Interference, 11 John, 1945. The entry's terse sentence held its own drama. WCA resolved conflicting vectors. Firing solution within acceptable variance. No periscope initiated. In plain terms, the boat had learned to trust its new ears. It had also learned a subtler lesson. Enemy tests were as dangerous as enemy attacks because they forced the silent program into the light. If an escort's calibration ping found the Archerfish at a weakness, the crew would have to choose between a hurried escape or staying quiet and relying on averaged bearings. That choice shaped the next phase, whether to be hunters or experiments. The final steps before patrol sealed the psychology of the mission. The captain issued standing orders that formalized silence into law. No unnecessary transmissions, no surface observations unless life was at stake, and a single authorized phrase to break protocol, rig for emergency, when evasive action was mandatory. Men wrote letters to be mailed by phantom hands if they did not return. They signed them with nicknames rather than full names. Small acts of economy in a world of paperwork. On the night the boat left the trial range, the sonar shack's instruments glowed like a chapel. The resolvers hummed faintly. The cuties slept in padded cradles, and the hull felt, to those who knew it, like an instrument tuned for a concert no one would ever hear. For weeks, Archerfish stalked convoys like a rumor. Then one midnight, the rumor answered back. It began as a faint harmonic beneath the drone of merchant screws, a double pulse that did not fit any catalogued ship. The sound man leaned closer to the QHB headset and wrote, "Dual cycle beat, 480 Hz overlay" in the margin of his log. At first he assumed a machinery echo, then the pitch held steady through 3 bearing changes. Commander Enright took one look at the plot and felt the hairs rise along his arm. Whatever it was listening to. In the silence that followed, the boat's hull carried the smallest tremor, a ping so narrow and sharp it seemed to thread through metal instead of striking it. It was no ordinary sonar. Analysts later matched the waveform to a pattern rumored to exist only on paper, the German S-Jurat 4, a continuous wave device capable of penetrating weak thermals. If the Japanese had one, the Allies' advantage in sound was vanishing. The reversal was immediate. Archerfish, built to prove American quiet, had become the hunted specimen in someone else's test. The captain ordered the motors down to a crawl. Gauges hovered between stillness and stall. Sweat condensed on the sonar shack's bulkhead as Mace counted the enemy pings. One every 40 seconds, climbing, searching. The bearing drifted 20 degrees starboard, then steadied. The escort above was triangulating, yet the pings dulled each time they met the thermal. The layer held. Archerfish lay inside its cold cocoon while the ocean carried the enemy's curiosity away like wind over glass. For 4 hours the duel continued, one ship calling, one ship refusing to answer. The WCA resolver traced the geometry of a blind conversation. Then without warning, the pings stopped. Silence flooded back with the weight of a confession. The escort had turned away. In that stillness, Enright made the only decision left to him, to follow the signal instead of flee from it. He suspected the strange sonar belonged not to an escort, but to a lead vessel testing new gear for an entire convoy route. If he could record its pattern, intelligence would learn how to cloak every American sub in return. The hunter's mission inverted. The quietest boat in the Pacific would now spy on the enemy's ears. The next 48 hours rewrote the patrol's meaning. Archerfish shadowed the convoy at periscope depth by night, submerged deep by day, feeding the QHB's output into the wax-coated wire recorders installed by the lab team. The men began calling the unknown contact Ghost Echo. Each time the escort pulsed its narrow beam, a faint harmonic tremor ran through the hull, felt more than heard, as if two technologies were whispering across generations. The recordings filled spool after spool until the engineers warned they were out of wire. Still, the captain stayed on course. The reversal had become obsession. The experiment was no longer about stealth alone, but about learning how silence could be mapped. On 22nd January, a decoded dispatch arrived via one-time pad. Proceed to secondary objective. Collect data on Uncharted emissions. Priority Alpha. Headquarters had read their brief burst transmission and raised the stakes. If Archerfish could capture a full cycle of the enemy system, it would give the Navy its first model of Axis continuous wave sonar. The crew felt both pride and dread. Pride because their readings mattered. Dread because to capture the data they had to remain within range of the very beam designed to destroy them. At 21:30 hours that night, the destroyer ahead dropped speed, perhaps to test depth scattering. The sub drifted under it, every switch guarded by fingers rather than clicks. A faint echo pulse slid through the water and grazed the stern planes with a metallic shimmer. One man swore he saw the hull lights dim as if the ping had drawn power itself. Mace whispered the new frequency into the log. S-Jurat variant, 495 Hz carrier, beat pattern modulated. The chief engineer nodded once. "They're painting us," he mouthed. But the layer bent the beam. Only fragments returned. The sea, cold and dense, kept its secret. For the first time, Enright allowed himself a thought he later regretted. Perhaps the ocean wanted silence as much as men did. He scribbled in his private notebook, found years later in archives, "Silence, not absence. Silence is design." The line captured the midpoint's turn. The patrol was no longer a tactical mission, it was a philosophical one. If the enemy could hear everything, then the only victory left was to master how not to exist at all. At dawn, the convoy broke north toward Kyushu. Archerfish stayed deep, her batteries draining to the last plates, listening until even static became music. When she finally surfaced to ventilate, the engineers spooled the wax wire into canisters marked Subject GE Complete. They did not know it then, but those recordings would seed an entire generation of post-war sonar countermeasure programs. The sea closed over their wake. The midpoint had delivered its reversal. The hunter was now the experiment, and the silence that once promised safety had become the very data the Navy hungered for. The convoy ahead thickened into a wall of silhouettes, and the ocean took on the heavy taste of fuel. The pencil marks on the chart met at a triangle so tight that the fire control board looked like a solved puzzle. Batteries were at the edge of safe discharge, yet the captain held the motors at a whisper and let the current slide them into the pocket beneath the thermal. The WCA resolver stabilized on a range rate that matched 8 knots exactly, a tell that the fat ship was towing the convoy's rhythm like a drum major. A micro reveal hid in the noise. The lead merchant carried a prop signature with a faint wobble every fifth blade turn, a hub defect that turned bearing drift into a metronome. The firing solution lived entirely in the math of water. The men set 2 Mark 14s for a shallow run on the tanker's starboard quarter and tucked a single Mark 27 cutie into the 4th tube with its gyro locked at straight. In silence, the act of opening the outer doors became choreography rather than motion. Grease on the hinges, canvas on the latches, fingertips on the steel to feel vibration rather than hear it. The torpedo data computer's dials walked into alignment as if pulled by tide, and a single chinograph line on the board shone under the red lamp like a runway. The sub never rose to periscope depth. The ocean would serve as sight. At 013, the boat loosed 2 steamfish a beat apart, and then waited long enough for the ocean to forget the decision. The Mark 14s rolled into their runs with only a faint rustle of guide studs across the tubes, and the ship slid 2 degrees starboard to keep the bearing drift honest. The cutie followed last, its nose filter listening for the bright chatter of an escort's screws rather than the tanker's bass throb. The moment stretched thin as wire. The men tracked the seconds by habit, not by clock. Then the first strike arrived as a soft punch that pushed air through the hull and back again, the textbook sign of a fuel hit inside a still bay. The second impact came high and close, a cough of pressure followed by the low thunder of oil finding flame. Above, the convoy's geometry shattered. Escorts broke formation in an old pattern: fan out, circle, drop, and then tripped over a new problem. Their own sonar pulses climbed the layer and lost strength coming back. Archerfish slid down and aft on mile power, letting the thermal fold over her like a blanket while the tanker burned. The cutie lived up to its stubborn nickname. It hunted along the escort's wake, heard the high harmonics through the clutter, and curved into the target with a small, hard pop. The soundman logged the detonation as a clean blade strike, a phrase that would make sense only to men who listened to war for a living. Silence reclaimed the water as if the fight had been a brief rumor. The destroyers filled the next hour with explosives. Depth charges thumped above the layer and rattled tool trays, a percussion that made breath taste like metal. The sub answered with stillness rather than speed. The chief engineer walked fingertips along the deck plates to feel for sympathetic rattles, and found only the low, contented hum of balanced motors. Every 10 minutes, the con altered course by a single degree to avoid laying a straight track. In the water, a change too subtle for mathematics taught in any academy, the men heard a pattern interrupt that did not belong to explosives. The sudden hush between drops where the enemy seemed to listen harder, as if staring through water. The layer held. The ocean stayed on Archerfish's side. A micro-reveal surfaced out of the smoke when the convoy tried to reform. The remaining merchant ships fell into a ragged line that bent shoreward, squeezing close to a shoal where charts warned of uncharted rises. The escorts shifted to the landward side to shield them from presumed seaward threats, leaving a slipstream of blind water behind. Archerfish slid into that slipstream and rested, a fish in a river eddy. The WCA blended bearings from the QHB and the loop without argument, and the fire control board offered a second firing point against a smaller freighter carrying crated vehicles on her aft deck. The captain let the chance pass. Silence was the mission's truer kill. The boat eased south under the thermal until the escort patterns grew tired and repetitive. The sea's pressure settled into an even hand on the hull, and the taste of oil on the air dwindled. The log recorded the kind of line submariners quietly treasure. No change in speed, no casualties, batteries within plan. The men made no celebration. The galley hatched a pot of coffee, and the mugs were wrapped in cloth to keep them from tapping steel. Above, a column of smoke marked what numbers could not fully say. The ocean swallowed proof quickly in the winter wind. When the sea finally emptied of searchers, Archerfish surfaced into a night that smelled like rain and ash. Ventilators opened, fans howled, and the boat took her first deep breath in a day. The engineers carried the waxwire canisters to a locker and stowed them among paint tins so they would look like tools if the worst happened. A short, tight transmission pulsed into the sky from the T antenna, riding a burst so brief it sounded like a fault to anyone not expecting it. It carried two messages in one: a tanker confirmed burning and subject GE recorded in full cycle. The radio man closed the key, and the night returned to its ordinary weather. The dawn after the attack brought a new discipline to the experiment. Rather than hunt the stragglers, Archerfish returned to her assigned lane and resumed listening. The science behind victory demanded a second sample, then a third, and the crew agreed to the arithmetic without needing speeches. Each day they moved, the boat like a microphone across the Luzon Strait, mapping the thermal's mood against enemy sonar habits, a sound cartographer drawing rivers no eye could see. A lab note later called this patient's noise field characterization. The crew called it the work. The final proof came quiet and far from glory. On a gray afternoon, a distant destroyer ran a continuous wave search at a slightly higher carrier, an S-Jurat variant testing for layer penetration. The QHB drew it as a narrow needle. The loop sketched it as a soft brush. The WCA's average predicted exactly where the beam would break on the thermal. The sub parked itself at that fracture line and waited. The next ping arrived as a long, thin shiver that died on the hull like a breeze at a doorway. The enemy never knew there was a room on the other side. The men learned a rule that would outlive the war. A quiet machine, parked at the ocean's own seam, could survive logic built for noise. The patrol's tactical success fit on one page: tonnage claimed, escorts evaded, patrol area maintained. The strategic success needed more paper. The canisters of wire left the boat under guard at Pearl and were carried straight into a room with no windows. Scientists unspooled the war and heard the shape of enemy ears. Within months, memoranda flowed with titles that did not mention Archerfish but echoed her work. Layer-optimized evasion protocol, narrow-band screw harmonic identification, and passive solution refinement without visual input. The boat's men saw only a few of these words, and even those looked like someone else's business. Their victory smelled like wet canvas, graphite, and coffee wrapped in cloth. The aftermath began before anyone named it. The shipyard stamped new tags for resilient mounts across the fleet, and chiefs in sonar shacks taped fresh frequency charts above their boards. Training films, stripped of names and dates, taught crews how to draw bearing drift like gospel and tuck themselves under the ocean's cold hand. The boat's unofficial boast remained unprinted. No crewman lost, no emergency blow, no panicked rush to the surface that would have stripped the skin from lungs. The success felt less like triumph than permission to keep breathing. The cover story that followed was dry by design. Patrol reports summarized contacts in language that could have described any Balao on any lane. The tanker became a vessel of opportunity, and the recording runs turned into routine passive observation. A small, neat line in a ledger marked the boat's patrol as satisfactory. The captain kept the sealed notebook with its sentences about silence, and the engineers pocketed their folded frequency slips like keepsakes. The crew went on liberty in Honolulu in the ordinary way, and the bar talk stayed carefully ordinary. Years later, a retired petty officer would hold up a metal tag at a reunion and say nothing, while the others read the date and the words stamped with a shop hammer. The tag had lived in a drawer under a pile of fishing lures and old keys. It looked like nothing the world would remember. The men smiled at a joke no one else had been taught. The epilogue fits inside a single artifact. In a climate-controlled drawer at a Navy archive lies a short spool of wax-coated wire labeled in faded pencil. G full cycle, Luzon Strait, Jan 45. The audio is quiet and thin, full of the sea's breath and a distant needle pulse that rises and falls with patient certainty. Between pings there is a hush that sounds like ordinary silence until the listeners are told what it is. It is a design, not an absence. It is the shape of a boat that chose to be a rumor and lived. Men trained by that rumor crossed the rest of the war without learning what panic tastes like, and the ocean kept their names. For decades, the Navy denied the mission ever happened, but the sonar logs still hum with the truth. If you like this video, please hit the like button and do not forget to subscribe for more videos like these.